Atari kills the cosmos. Commodore bets on games. And British retail discovers microcomputers. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl, and joined again by my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
So
yeah, I went back to normal.
You went back to normal. That's good. I like predictability in these things.
Tradition, dude. It's called
tradition. Yes, we've been doing this for 3 years, man. Come on.
Seriously?
Yeah, November marks the
already?
3rd anniversary of the show. Yeah, it's kind of scary, but
oh Lord.
Video Game Newsroom Time Machine has been around for 3 whole years.
Isn't it amazing how quickly time passes when having fun?
Yeah, and even when doing this. So
exactly.
Okay, we've got a ton of stories to get through today, so we kind of have to cut the banter short despite the celebrations. As always, remember, everybody, you can follow us on the Twitter, follow us on the Instagram. You can also support us on the Patreon, where you can get early access to our next 3 interview episodes. Right now we've got, I believe, Jeff Stevenson, former tech guy from Sierra. We've got Jerry Jewell, co-founder of Sirius Software. And the latest one that just went up is our interview with Damon Sly, co-founder of one of my favorite studios of all time, Dynamics, and designer of my all-time favorite game, Project Firestart. So absolutely amazing interview with him. Really cool guy. So, yeah, those are already up for everybody else to hear. And, of course, the episode right before this, we finally released to the general public our interview with Paul Neurath of Looking Glass. So lots of fun stuff. I got a whole bunch more already in the can and some more good ones coming down the pipeline. So, if you like what we're doing here and want to help us, pay for the hosting costs and whatnot, then please drop us $1 every month and become a Patreon supporter, where you will also be able to get the video version of a little segment we like to call the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must spend 7 minutes playing a game that was reviewed during the time jump of the episode, which in this case is going back 40 years to November of 1981. And that game for this episode is one of the all-time classics in the arcades, Galaga by Namco. So, Peter, are you ready to dive in to 7 Minutes in Heaven with Galaga?
I'm so incredibly ready, man.
Excellent. Then let's have at it. Waiting for it to come. Okay. Welcome back, Peter, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, based off of just what you saw, what is Galaga?
Oh, this is actually pretty easy to describe. Galaga is a little modernized and way harder Space Invaders.
Okay. And how was it modernized?
Well, you have... On the one hand, you have colors now. I think the original Space Invaders was just black and white. And the movement pattern of the alien ships is more elaborate. So they move around on the screen. They're coming in groups of, I think, 6 or 10 or something in between ships, and they're moving on the screen around on the screen and go into a formation, and then they start shooting at you while at the same time also flying towards you, and you have to dodge the bullets, you have to dodge the incoming ships, and at the same time you have to shoot all the mother ships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good. And I guess you didn't get to the part where you can save an extra ship and dock it with yours and all that fun stuff, right?
I mean, it was 7 minutes, so I played through the entire game. Me being a programmer, we already established that. So, of course, I have not seen that, because who needs another ship? I'm a lone wolf.
Very good. And so did you find the game easy or difficult?
A mixture of both. I mean, we have to mention that it is 11 o'clock and I got up at 5 a.m. So
11 p.m. you mean?
11 p.m. Yeah, I got up 6 hours ago, and I need a nap desperately. No, but this really this slows down my reaction time, of course. But enough excuses made up.
That's the excuse I would use, yeah.
Yeah, of course. You have to take what's there. But no, actually, I think it's rather difficult. I mean, in the beginning, it's fairly simple, although you'll see me failing miserably when watching the video. But in the beginning, it's actually fairly simple, but I think the movement gets quicker and there are more ships coming towards you while shooting at you at the same time. So in the beginning, there were just a couple of ships shooting, and then even in the second level, there were ships shooting, flying towards you, and other ships shooting at you, and trying to keep the focus is actually pretty hard. When I understand it right, it was one of those old arcade games, wasn't it?
Yes, this was an arcade release originally by Namco, and in the U.S. it was then distributed by Midway.
Ah, okay. So I think it's a pretty decent game for an arcade. You can get better when practicing, but you actually have to practice a lot. So pulling coins is basically the name of the game.
Oh, definitely. And it was a game that truly knew how to pull in the coins.
Oh, yeah.
Galaga is going to become one of the all-time classics. And I believe next year already we're going to be seeing its sequel, Galaxian, which in some ways is, I believe, an almost bigger hit. So, yeah, this is really, together with Pac-Man, it's kind of like Namco is just knocking them out of the park one after the other at this point. And we will even see, I believe it's Galaga that shows up again in the early PlayStation games. They installed it as a game that you could play while your main game was loading. So in those early days when the CDE drives were very slow in the consoles, you could actually play Galaga while you were waiting for Ridge Racer to load.
Really?
Yeah. They actually got a patent on this. So nobody else could do it in their games, could have loading games.
Loading mini games?
For a while. Yeah, until the patent expired. So
I actually tried to remember. I've played one game where you had a mini game while loading. No, while installing. Sorry, I mixed it up.
Yeah, probably a way of skirting the patent, but yeah. So for quite a while, this was a pretty big deal. But yeah, so Galaga, all-time classic, hardcore game. I believe there was just actually a couple weeks ago, there was somebody, they're still trying to port really good versions of Galaga to a lot of the old home micros. Somebody's working on a C64 port. I believe there was one at the time, but it was okay, but okay-ish. But yeah, getting a good version of Galaga, especially given the number of sprites on the screen and their movements, definitely not something that standard hardware and the home could do at that time.
At the moment, yeah. I mean, my PC was basically smoking hot after those 7 minutes.
Oh yeah. You get Galaga running at 60 frames per second, you better have a hefty machine under the hood.
You.
Okay.
No, but I really enjoyed this game. I think it's a game that you come play for like 10 minutes and then you're out. So
Yeah. I mean, it's the classic arcade where you'll probably throw in a couple of quarters, just to see if you can get a little bit better than you did before. But you don't necessarily have to spend, 20 hours in one sitting on it. That's not the idea of the arcade to begin with. So yeah, no. Excellent. Okay, so we have Galaga under our belts, and before we can turn on the time machine and head back to see what was making news in yesteryear, we need to find out what we messed up in our October 1981 jump in a little segment we call the Department of Corrections. Welcome back, Ethan, to the Department of Corrections.
Yes.
You've been traveling. Now, our listeners didn't notice that you were gone because we've timed this so unbelievably well. But
perfectly.
Your research trip was successful, I take it?
It was a time. I have many court papers in front of me. If you are one of the people who helped subsidize these court papers, then thank you very much.
Excellent. Well then, Ethan, we need to get back to business.
Yes.
We need to find out what I got wrong in our October 1981 jump. But before that,
it is time for the Peter comment. That's right. That's right, everybody. It's back. We're back. It's time to roll. So, Peter making comments about not wanting to live in 1941. Very accurate. Good. Yes. Very. Excellent. Excellent observation, Peter. Your check is in the mail. Anyways, we are on to the corrections, and we're staying in 1941 for just a second. Not too long. We don't want to look at someone the wrong way. That would be bad. But pinball, as you described, a general. It wasn't a ruling, but just like judge comments on pinball. You said that pinball was normally on a wall. It was not on a wall. What you are probably thinking of is all-win games, which are more similar to pachinko. They were on a wall in Europe. They're somewhat bagatelle inspired, but they are not pinball.
Oh, good point. Good point. Now, how would you define the difference between them? Just the positioning of the table?
Well, an all-win doesn't have any pin. Well, you can have pins, but an all-win goes through a loop. You launch the ball with kind of a flicking device. So, again, more similar to pachinko. And it will go up and go through some lanes and then try to land in a center hole. Whereas a pinball has holes across the board. You go from the top and then gravity pulls it to the bottom.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. If you want to know a little bit more, then you can listen to my episodes on the Memory Machine podcast with Nate Lockhart about old coin-op games.
And we will definitely have a link to that in the show notes.
Cross-promotion all over the place. Isn't it wonderful? Next up, you were confused about exactly what was the deal with Kix and how it was developed. So this is what it is. So Kix, Taito America did not have any internal development when it was starting to say, okay, we need more video games because we can't get enough from Japan. So they found an outside developer who were Randy and Sandy Pfeiffer, and they said, make a game. And so they did not have the concept for Kix or anything. So the Pfeiffers came up with Kix, gave it to Taito America. They manufactured it.
Okay, gotcha. That makes more sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to a technical point, another one to Peter. For Peter does not get many things outside of his comment. So to Peter, I'm correcting you. The Peter correction. So
you'll love this.
So data from a satellite. The problem is not processing power; it is accuracy of to be able to actually hit a moving target that is moving several thousand miles an hour above you. He made some sort of comment about processing power needing to be greater for satellites, but a lot of that, like laser, is an analog thing because it can submit digital signals, but it is a light. It is analog.
True. This is true. And yes, it's not really a computer issue at that point. Unless, of course, I think it was in the context of GPS type tracking? I believe that's what the context was.
You kind of went off on a tangent of stuff that was related to it. You said something about the Telstar and the Telstar was up in the 50s, and they weren't using traditional computers for that. So
good point. Okay, so Peter, you have been corrected. Congratulations.
Next up, the Sega system hardware was not called Change a Game. That was the system hardware of CVS software, which has nothing to do with the pharmacy. CVS software was just a very minor company that had the one hit, quote unquote, with Hunchback. Their thing was called Change a Game. Sega's thing was called Convert a Game.
Gotcha. And I mixed those two up. Sorry.
Yes.
My bad.
Next on, you were talking about the one of the first games that allowed you to pump more money in order to continue the game and whatnot. I can't remember what the game was, but it was not the first game with a continue, but I forget how the continue worked in Super Cobra, which was the first game, as far as we know, that had a continue function. First game that, chronologically came out in Japan that had a continue function.
Yeah, because the game that I was referring to, well, they were actually advertising it as being the first game with a they weren't calling it continue, they were calling it a buy-in feature. And this would have been for the US release. So they were dating it as a U.S. release premiere of that feature.
I'm pretty sure Super Cobra came out in the U.S. before that as well. But it's find it all to talk about that, especially because it is a very important, overlooked part of how arcades really started to change and games, and this would be the thing that comes into the home and whatnot. But you just posed the question. I don't know if this is the first one with a feature like this. Super Cobra did have a continue, but I think it continues you at a checkpoint basically. It doesn't keep your score.
And I think that's what Moon Shuttle did, because this was about Taito's Moon Shuttle, and it actually kept the score. And obviously, also the side effect of that is that it totally messes up the value of a high score if you can just keep buying your way into the high score.
Right.
Yeah.
So and then at a certain point becomes meaningless, and then console games show a new direction of how games are engaging. But that is a story yet to come.
This is true.
And on to the next part. You were talking about Atari's vector games, and so here's the story as has been told by somebody who I'm hoping to interview fairly soon. Larry Rosenthal, the guy who invented the vector display for the arcade. He had this prototype that he was carrying around that he would hook into televisions and then just show people both a lunar landing game and a Space Wars, Space War type game that is later called Space War with an S. And he went to the story is that he went to Atari and he showed Atari this stuff, and so they did not, and they didn't want it. So they, at the time, and so he left. But they did not steal the technology from him. They went off and developed their own version of the vector technology.
Okay.
The one thing you can really find out about vector games is like how the monitor works, because like everyone who has ever had to own a vector game has had to figure that out. So there's plenty of documentation on this stuff. They are fundamentally different, but when Cinematronic sued Atari, they were probably going after this very broad definition of what the patent meant. So even though it wasn't the exact method that they used, that they were able to sue them on that. But the story is that Rosenthal went to Atari. He showed them that he was working on a game like this, and they went off and did their own thing.
Gotcha. Okay, that clears that up.
Indeed. And next up, we're jumping all over this place. There's quite a bit, but we will get to the end of it in time. Next up, licensing from Coleco. I forget what the context of this is, but you said that Mike Katz was the guy in charge of that. No, it was Al Kahn. And maybe that Mike Katz tries to claim credit for it, but Al Kahn's literal job was the guy to do the light.
Yeah, no, it's not that Mike Katz took credit for it, and I might have misspoken. Mike Katz was just emphasized how important the licensing was in their overall strategy. So he didn't take credit for actually signing up the licenses, but it was something that came up, and I probably misspoke saying that he was doing the licensing, but no, he in my interview with him, link in the show notes below, he just emphasized how they realized that getting those licenses would be so important. That's why they also pursued things like the Donkey Kong license as a pack-in game for the Coleco when it did ship, because they knew without some big heavy hitter licenses, they were not going to be able to make the machine a success.
And that particular license, that particular license was supposedly not Alcon. That was Eric Bromley doing it himself. That's a story he tells. I don't know what Alcon has.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that would be an interesting he said, she said if they did have different stories. But this story was in the context of their little mini arcade tabletop consoles.
Right.
Yeah.
The VFDs and all that.
Yes. Yeah, the ColecoVision is what, 83?
No, 82.
It's 82. Okay. So ColecoVision is no doubt already in the background. They're already developing it. It's just not going to be out for this Christmas. For the 81 Christmas.
Yeah. August 82 is when it officially comes out.
Gotcha.
So you'll be talking about, and it's announced at the January seat. You'll be talking about very soon. Next up, Castle Wolfenstein. You were making a description of it, and you said that there are disguises. There are no disguises in the original Castle Wolfenstein, only in Return to Castle Wolfenstein.
Yeah, I got the two mixed up. I played a lot more of Return than Castle, so that's why I had that stuck in the back of my head.
And then, talking about arcades once again, you said that the Polybius legend comes from this time, were your words. And no, it does not. The Polybius legend is a modern myth that was translated back into the golden era of the arcade.
Yeah, and yeah, that's true. That's true.
You can go watch Ahoy's video on this to get the full scoop.
Yeah, that's a great video.
You need to watch no other video on Polybius. All of the rest of them do not matter.
This is true. Well, Ahoy is so good on so many of his videos. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, and I do have one correction of my own.
Yes, Carl is correcting himself.
Well, no. Compute Magazine is correcting themselves. So in their October issue, they mentioned that the Minnesota School Board, super important organization in the history of microcomputers, they had signed up with Atari, and they had reported it as a replacement of Apple. And it turns out they're just diversifying the machines that are available to them. So they are adding Atari machines to the mix, but they will also still be acquiring machines from Apple. And they corrected themselves in the November issue.
Look at what research does to us.
Yes.
So
yes.
Concluded. This time on the Department of Corrections, you may continue slacking off until next time in October of 1991.
You mean in... that's right. We have to do...
that correct.
We have so many more. Yes. Okay. You're right. Ethan, we thank you for your service.
Goodbye.
Carl, something happened.
What happened?
I just realized that no one is safe. No one is safe from Ethan's corrections.
You mean even you had to be corrected?
Even I was corrected. Yes.
It happens. It happens to the best of us.
So this is how it feels like.
Yeah. Now you understand my pain.
Well, I mean, it was one thing for me, and the other hour he basically just talked about you. So I'm still fine.
And somehow every week I keep coming back for more. I'm a glutton for punishment. Okay, enough of that. Let's move on and turn on the time machine. But before we can go back to November of 1981, we must first turn the machine back even further and head back to November of 1951. So we don't have a sound effect for this one. But I'm sure you can imagine some clip where it's Leave It to Beaver or something. Okay. Although that probably came out later in the 50s. Doesn't matter. So, Peter, what's our story from November of 1951?
Our story of 1951. Man challenges machine to a game of chess.
Donald Jacobs, the head of Jacobs Instrument Company, a maker of, among other things, computers, has challenged Computer Research Corporation's CRC 102 electronic brain, and I put that in quotes, to a game of chess. The dare is in response to CRC's claim that their new computer is so smart it could play an unbeatable game of chess, something that Jacobs says their very similar computer could not do, and he doesn't believe is possible.
So, was it possible?
Well, we never quite found out because CRC chickened out.
Right. So it was not possible.
Yeah, they initially said, sure, we'll take this on. And a couple days later, and this is all, I tracked this primarily through New York Times articles on the topic. And just a few days later, they were like, our electronic brain is so busy right now working on problems for the government that, we just don't have time for this kind of,
Really? They chickened out with the I'm busy thing?
Yeah, the computer's busy. Now, it's interesting because I found some interesting articles about the caveats that CRC put on their acceptance of the wager. For example, they wanted to make sure that, that there was no outside input being given, that nobody was giving the computer the answers. And also that the idea was that it's an electronic brain. So the computer would actually have to teach itself how to play, as opposed to having somebody give it, winning moves built into the software. So very much what we would do nowadays with a computer with computer learning, that's what they were talking about already there, even though the vocabulary didn't exist. Of course, CRC came back and was like, well, the computer won't be able to move the pieces and stuff, so we'll have to do some of the stuff for the computer. And once all of that was worked out and the caveats were agreed to, that's when they basically chickened out.
Shit, he accepted our caveats.
Yeah, exactly. It was great. It was like, dude, you totally. And the best part is this Jacobs guy. He actually did some press shots where he's sitting in front of a chess board and things. So he really milked it because there was no way this computer could actually do that back then. It was just not conceivable that this computer could do that. But it's one of those moments where you're really like, don't write checks that your ass can't cash. That's really what this is about. And so I thought it was very funny, and it is computer game related, so perfect for the podcast.
Oh yeah.
And so if you want to see a link to that photo of the guy and stuff, I put all the links in the show notes. It's definitely worth reading up on. Okay, but that's all we've got for November of 1951. Let's turn on the time machine and head back 50 years to November of 1971. And again, sorry, no sound effects for this one. But you can imagine, the end of the Summer of Love or something in the background.
So a funeral march. Okay. 1971, Stanford Daily reports on the Galaxy games.
Stanford's student paper has a report on a new amusement available at the Tresider, and I think I'm pronouncing that right, Student Union, a computer-driven game played on a screen. Galaxy Game is an adaptation of Space War, possibly the first video game as we know them today. A second multi-screen version was installed in 1972, which would stay at Stanford until 2000, when it was moved to the Computer Game History Museum.
Okay, let's just take it for what it is.
Okay. You know what Space War is? I talked about it a few times on the show.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Okay, so that was a game played on a big mainframe computer. You know, the star in the middle, two ships trying to shoot each other. And there was this attempt to turn that into a coin-operated amusement using an actual computer. Remember, this is before we've really they're using, I think, a mini computer in this, but microcomputers are still a couple years away. And so they've built this arcade machine and they've put it on the college campus in the student union. That's basically the recreation center for the students. And it's never becomes commercially viable just because the mini computer is so damn expensive.
Yeah.
And they end up doing this 2-screen version, and it's not, two players playing against each other with their own screens. It's quite literally two-player games because the mini computer has enough processing power to run both of them simultaneously. And so it stays there more or less as a novelty. And we're going to be talking very soon about how Nolan Bushnell creates a version of the game as well, a more simplified version using discrete logic. So not using computers, but using, individual chips. And that's going to be the first coin-operated, mass-produced arcade game that is using a video screen for the display. But we're going to get to that. That's coming. But we see here this first report on this thing. There's going to be a couple more reports. I believe there's going to be one in Rolling Stone that's coming up relatively soon that we're also going to be talking about. But this is, I believe the first known version of this from the Stanford Daily. Again, our good friend Ethan was responsible for getting me the article on this one.
So Ethan is basically doing correction prevention.
I've probably messed up something in my description here that he's going to be able to correct, so not a problem.
Okay.
I'll probably also add a link. There's a good episode of They Create Worlds that goes into the history of this machine. So I'll add that into the show notes if anybody wants to delve deeper. And it's definitely a fascinating topic. Yeah.
Talking about fascinating topics, let's move on. MITS introduces their digital calculator.
Very good.
This is really hard to pronounce.
Yes, it is. Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, a small electronics company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, has released a 4-function digital calculator kit for $175, which adorns the cover of this month's popular electronics magazine. MITS would have a hit on their hands, hitting $100,000 in monthly sales with the calculator and helping pave the way for their most famous kit, the Altair 880 kit computer in 1975.
So we basically paid $175 for a thing that can do add, subtract, and
multiply and divide. And you have to put it together yourself because it's a kit.
Oh, you even had fun. I mean, it almost sounds like a Lego piece, and the price fits Lego as well.
Well, and granted, this is 1971 money, so you have to at least quintuple that in modern money. But the thing with this is, those kind of calculators existed before, but they were mechanical calculators. That's what you did, for bookkeeping and stuff. The idea of doing it digitally here with chips is the big innovation. The fact that it's got, a digital display is the big innovation. And it is still something for the hobbyist community. It's not something that's being mass produced. So that's also adding to the cost of it. And the idea that this thing becomes so popular that they're doing $100,000 in revenue a month, quintuple that for modern money, and you're just this tiny little company, is huge. And of course, the Altair 880 is going to be the first microcomputer. It's where Microsoft makes BASIC. as their first big product. This is the start of the computer world as we know it. And a large part of it's going to be financed because of this digital calculator. So it's where it all gets started.
Talking about things starting, Intel launches the 4004.
Yes. The first complete CPU on one chip and the first commercially available microprocessor, the Intel 4004, has hit the market. With the same processing power as the first electronic computer built in 1946, this fingernail-sized chip was the beginning of a true revolution in computing that would make the machines we know today possible.
Oh, Lord. I mean, miniaturization surely is a trend since the 1950s. Do you know what the price for the 4004 was?
The Wikipedia entry again, and I know Wikipedia is a terrible, terrible source for these things, but, maybe, just maybe. Okay, here. It sold for $60 when released in 1971.
Okay, adjusted for inflation, what do you think, like 300 bucks
five times that.
Yeah, cool.
So, I mean, it's not terribly expensive when you think about it. I mean, granted, it's still expensive, but it's not terribly expensive.
Actually, I don't think it's expensive at all. I think what do modern days processors cost? Basically the same. So.
Well, this is true. This is true. And I mean, granted, at this point, there's not a lot you can do with it as such. I mean, it's only a 4-bit processor, and you would have to build your own boards and everything around it to make it usable.
Yeah, okay.
So it's more, I don't want to say a proof of concept, but it's clearly something that is just starting out.
Yeah.
But it's going to evolve very, very quickly. One of the follow-up chips after this is going to be the heart of the 8800, the Altair 8800, and of course, it's going to spawn everything else from there.
Cool. All right. And now to the real important topics. Pay TV is coming to a hotel room near you.
While not directly related to video games, an important step in the direction of interactive entertainment has arrived with a new system being tested that will allow hotel guests to order uninterrupted movies in their room. The systems will price a viewing between $2 and $3, and 2 different systems are profiled by the New York Times, one using a broadcast signal for the films running on a loop, and the other using pre-recorded tapes on site.
I don't know. Pay TV somehow has some...
Are you trying to suggest that maybe when you think about this concept, you're only thinking about porn?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Because then... that isn't necessarily a bad thought. The interesting thing here is that people's entertainment consumption habits had been changing dramatically throughout the 60s. Mm-hmm. The movie industry at this point in the early 70s is going through a major downturn. It's quite literally crumbling. The studios don't know how they're going to continue to turn profits. People aren't going to the movies anymore. And there's this really interesting discussion in the article about how this idea of selling a viewing for $2 to $3, which is very comparable to what a movie ticket cost back then, maybe even a little bit more, was actually targeting people who were not going to the movies, like the business traveler or the executive or whatever. These were not people who would normally take time out of their schedule to go to the movies any longer. And by being able to reach them through this method with relatively new films, they were essentially expanding their market and using the latest technology, this idea of having encoded broadcast signals with an encoder box in the room. That's already pretty high tech. And the other idea was having these pre-recorded tapes and maybe even having some kind of computerized system to control, who gets to see what when, is another application of computer technology into an area that, number one, didn't exist before and probably wouldn't be viable without it.
I mean, from a technical standpoint, it's really, really interesting. But still, I'm still caught up on the And I don't even know why. I think it's just because when I watch a movie or a TV show and they're mentioning pay TV, it always has this shady touch to it.
And obviously that became one of the big money makers, especially after everybody started going to the movies again once the summer blockbuster becomes the thing to do with movies like Jaws and Star Wars and so forth. Then everybody, by the mid-70s, everybody's going back to the movies.
Yeah.
But there's these years here where the movie theaters are really dying. They don't know how to get people to watch the product any longer. And this was, an interesting way of doing it. But once everybody's going to the movies again, I mean, why are you going to watch the cropped 4:3 version of a movie that's in the theaters, and when you could just go to the multiplex and watch the film? So
yes. And it's just so weird, man. You watch this shady pay TV, and then you pay at the reception, and the receptionist exactly knows what you did last night. So,
I think you just have a weird shame about the sex stuff. Yeah, it's. I think that's just a personal problem, but I'm not here to judge. It's okay. It's okay, Peter. It's okay. Okay, let's change the topic.
Let's
move on.
You know what? Let's get into the future. Let's go into the future. Let's go forward to 1981.
Wait, we got to play a sound effect because otherwise people will believe we're really traveling through time. So here's the sound effect.
Rapidly becoming an international craze. Computer revolution. 1981.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer.
Right in the midst of it, thank you.
Welcome to November of 1981. Peter, what's our first story?
Well, our first story proves we are in the future because Cosmos cancelled. Shit, I read called. Damn it. All right. Didn't call, was canceled.
Atari's holographic game system, Cosmos, which we talked about back in our February 1981 episode, has been shelved. Apparently, adding a holographic image behind an antiquated red dot game matrix wasn't enough to wow the sophisticated 1981 gamer anymore.
Yeah, they wanted more to have the 4D experience, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of putting this holographic image that you could slide in and out of the game, it didn't add anything to the actual game experience. It was just a gimmick. And unfortunately, this kind of thing, its time has come. Like we've been talking about recently, I believe in the last 40-year jump, we talked about how Coleco has just purchased a bunch of rights to make their little mini arcade tabletops. People are expecting more from the handheld market, and this device wasn't adding anything to the gameplay. They were just adding to the imagery of it. And that just they realized it before launching it that it wasn't going to fly. So good on Atari for killing the project before it hit the market and ended up being a massive money sink in returns.
No, I mean, it's good that Atari finally decided to cancel something.
Oh, they're going to cancel a lot of stuff.
Maybe
but that's all coming down. That's coming down the pipeline.
All right. We are still in the future because gaming is coming to a wrist near you.
Game Time is the name of the first wristwatch cum game from General Consumer Electronics. GCE is a new firm headed by Ed Krakauer, who was the general manager of Mattel Electronics. The watch itself was designed by Jay Smith, president of Smith Engineering.
Yeah, I was thinking of General Electronics, and I was wondering why GCE is a new firm. But yeah, because it's not GE. This is the explanation.
It's not GE, not General Electric, no. So
yeah. This product, this game wrist watch thing.
Yeah.
Was it successful? Because I've heard of it.
Well, I mean, it's going to be sort of the beginning of a boom of miniature LCD wristwatch games, which are going to be huge throughout the 80s. And what this one is doing, which is very different from the later ones, where the later ones were things like, you're a little headless robot moving back and forth left to right, and there's little robot heads dropping, and you have to catch as many as you can as they speed up and stuff. This one is actually using a dot matrix. It's just a whole bunch of dots, and it has several different games built into it, which give you different configurations. So, there's like a little ball and paddle type thing. There's one where, target shooting, stuff flying by. I mean, it's not super complicated stuff, but it is closer to, this is actually closer, from what I could tell, to the Microvision, which was Milton Bradley's handheld cartridge console system that we talked about 2 years ago now. And that was released back in 79. And I mean, it's very simplistic. I've got some links to the device in the show notes. You can go check it out there. But overall, it does look like a fairly successful device. It does get a couple of follow-ups. But like I said, the big ones that are going to come out of Asia later on that have more defined characters are going to be far more successful, I believe.
I mean, this would actually have been the ideal version of a Tamagotchi.
Yeah, a Tamagotchi type of thing would have, however, required a much higher resolution. I mean, this thing, if it had 20 by 20, it was a high res. And also, you would have needed a much more powerful processor and more RAM to do a Tamagotchi, because you would have had to store all the animations and stuff, and that would have just killed this. That would have just killed this device.
And the battery. Okay.
Oh, and a quick little side note, Jay Smith, the designer of this, he used to be an engineer at Mattel, and he would go on to work with GCE developing the Vectrex, which is a game console we'll be talking about soon.
Okay, looking forward to it. In the meantime, Mattel grabs the Dungeons and Dragons license.
In order to bolster its electronics division, Mattel has gone all in on big licenses. Besides sports licenses, it now has the king of fantasy gaming, D&D, which it will develop as both cartridge games for the Intellivision and a handheld game in addition to an electronic board game.
A handheld game.
A handheld game, yes. It was a little electronics game. You could compare it with Hunt the Wumpus. So it displayed this slightly angled version of a maze to sort of give the illusion that you're kind of in the maze. And you had to move through the maze in 90-degree angles. And believe there is like a magic potion you had to find and a sword or something else. It had a couple of buttons on the sides. Again, you can actually play digital versions of this online. I'll put a link to that in the show notes over at archive.org. And there's a monster in the cave that is running around, and I think you have to get to the exit before the monster catches you. So it's actually fairly complex. And the weird thing is, I didn't have this game when I was a kid, but they reskinned it as a Masters of the Universe game a couple of years later. And I had that as a kid, a little He-Man game. And I could never understand what the hell it was all about, because on the background they put this picture of Castle Grayskull. And then on top of it are suddenly these lines. And you're like, I don't know what these lines mean. I mean, I'm thinking, I'm buying this game and I'll just, run around as He-Man hitting stuff, and suddenly, I'm supposed to be in this dungeon and I'm supposed to be running away from something. It's like, but I'm supposed to be He-Man. Why am I running away? It didn't make any sense. So, yeah. But
you're chasing it around the globe. You're not running away.
No, I'm running away. It's quite literally, if it catches you, you die. It's like, but I'm He-Man. No. So yeah, it was a bad fit for that, and it was one of my childhood traumas. But yes,
Should have called it Maze Runner, and everything would have been fine.
there you go. And the Intellivision games, there's going to be two of them. First one is sort of an overhead type of thing, and the second one is actually going to have that first-person dungeon crawl aesthetic to it. So it's yeah, I mean they're going to do some cool stuff with the license for the time.
Okay. Hey, you know what? Talking about dungeons.
Yes. Tell me about
TSR.
dungeons.
Yeah, I'll tell you about dungeons. TSR advertises dungeon !
There you go. Part of TSR's $1 million Christmas ad campaign, a 30-second commercial promoting their Dungeon board game, will be hitting the airwaves. Designed to introduce the whole family to the concepts of fantasy role-playing, the ad will not only promote the board game, but also mention the entire family of D&D products and highlight the company as a whole.
Hey, when was the time when D&D makes you go being a follower of the devil?
That is coming up next year.
Okay.
I believe that's coming up next year, because remember the story that's all built around that poor young guy who ends up committing suicide, that already happened last year. We talked about that last year.
Okay.
So it's coming, and for right now, if you read through any of the trade magazines for the toy industry, they're all still talking about how D&D, they can't keep it on the shelves. It's selling super well, even though at this point in the United States, there's a massive economic downturn. There's a full-blown recession going on. And these relatively expensive books are still selling like hotcakes.
Yeah.
And so D&D and the other role-playing games are just going gangbusters. I don't know exactly when they started development of it, but the D&D cartoon is also not far away at this point.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that anti-D&D backlash is coming. It's just not quite here yet. So this attempt by TSR to get the entire family into playing, it's not going to backfire on them, but it's also not going to work all that well.
Okay. I mean, that didn't work that well. We'll see next year. And
now, granted, their sales are not going to be hurt by the controversy. They're still going to be selling the stuff. I'm not going to. I don't know. I'd have to actually look at their numbers, but they're going to be doing just fine financially. It's really more an issue of, are they going to be able to expand their market to their non-traditional demographics? And that's going to be much more difficult.
I mean, it's they had something actually like last year, when people just went into Animal Crossing, just run away and hide in fantasy worlds to escape, at least for a moment, the sad reality you're living in.
Oh, definitely. I mean, during bad economic times, fantastical pop culture is huge. And there is an argument to be made there. But I think it's also an issue that the role-playing phenomenon hit at just the right time when people were getting a little bit more sophisticated about their media consumption, and they were looking for a more complex activity. They wanted something more out of their entertainment, and this just happened to scratch this very, very unique itch that people had. You have to remember, it's the people who grew up on television, and this was also one of the reasons why the movie industry was doing so poorly, because people were getting so much TV, they were getting so much content over television, the movies had to offer something that you couldn't get on TV. So you couldn't just sell a police story anymore and as a movie because, I got police stories 5 times a week on the TV. You're going to have to give me something that the TV can't offer me, something bigger, bolder, something that maybe is more critical of society, something that challenges me in some way or provides a new experience. And because people are bombarded with 24/7 media at this point, and I know in our day and age to even be talking about television being this influential when we have so many other streams of media, it still meant that they wanted something more. And this interactivity that the role-playing game gave you had a similar effect than video games did. So video games was about, I can suddenly manipulate what's on the screen as opposed to simply consuming it. But it couldn't give me a very deep story yet. You still had the text adventures and stuff, but even those, you can only do what the programmer put in there. The experience of D&D is taking that to that next step of you can do anything you want. It's opening up the world. It's the ultimate open world experience. And so that is really why it's grabbing the attention that it's grabbing.
Yeah, this is actually true.
Yeah.
Well, nowadays movie theaters just add 3D, so oh well.
Well,
another topic entirely.
Movie theaters are, COVID aside, movie theaters have a very different value proposition.
Yeah.
They are adding something else entirely, which is the communal experience that you can't get at home, a certain amount of nostalgia for the big thing, turning it into an event, having to go someplace does add value. It makes it feel more special. And also you're getting something that is exclusively in the theater for a certain period of time, and the ability to then talk about it with other people or at least brag that you've already seen it. So you turn it into a social engagement. You go with your friends. Like, for example, before times, we used to go to every big Marvel movie that came out, right? And we would go watch those together most of the time. And so that experience, it wasn't just about the movie at that point. It was also about, getting together and doing something together, and then afterwards talking about it together, because we then had this shared experience. And so that is similar to D&D. If you get people who play D&D together, they will start telling their adventures as if they had actually lived through something, because in a way they did. And, war stories of their old characters and all this. So there is an argument to be made that the interactivity of this medium, in this case role-playing, but also video games and computer games, is something that people who grew up on television, the kids of the early 80s, who didn't know a world without television, they need that next step. They need that next challenge in their media consumption, and this is it. So, okay, that's enough armchair psychology. Let's keep moving. We got a lot more stories to cover.
We got a lot more stories. So let me ask you one question. You have to ask
away. Ask away.
Thank you. Breaking the flow. So what is the best game?
The two most renowned names in gaming journalism, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz, have a nice piece in the New York Times breaking down the options a consumer can choose from in the realm of programmable game systems. Interestingly, they say that 2 million such devices have been sold so far that year, with 3 million more expected in 1982. The 5 systems profiled are the VCS, Odyssey 2, Intellivision, Bally Professional Arcade, and the Channel F. Both the Bally and Channel F have been bought by new companies, Astrovision and Zircon respectively, and are given middling faith that they can regain market share. Atari's next quote-unquote super system is mentioned as coming in the next year, with other possible competitors being unlikely due to the high cost of entry into the market given the size of existing software libraries.
So what is the best game?
Well, and this is one of the interesting things, the game that they're referring to is actually the system. So this idea of talking about the individual games as games and not the system as a game is a leftover from the standalone Pong devices days.
Yeah.
When, you bought the machine because it played one game or it played 10 variations of one game. So this is where you're getting that mixture of words. They also review a bunch of standalone games for each of the systems, but those are just like a half a sentence or something each. And but it is interesting. They give a pretty accurate prediction of everything, especially the 2600 being the top machine. And interestingly enough, they also mention Activision as a separate game system. So they distinguish Activision because they're, at the time of writing, they were probably the only third party. They probably hadn't heard of Imagic yet. And so this idea that this third party publisher making games for the 2600 gets its own column in their final breakdown. As you know,
Okay.
Which games should you be buying? And it's like, well, yeah, Activision games, they're great. They look great. And this is it's an interesting phenomenon because it really does show that when you were looking at one of these systems, you weren't looking at this system as the platform to buy games from a whole bunch of different publishers. If you bought an Atari system, you were buying Atari's games. If you were buying the Channel F, you were buying the Zircon games, and so on and so forth. And so this is a really fascinating little insight into how people are talking about these things and how people understand the relationships between manufacturer and device. And so, yeah, it's a very cool little article.
Okay. Moving on, and getting closer to Christmas, Atari admits to Easter egg in Adventure.
That's right. Warren Robinette's famous secret room in Adventure, where he included a credit to himself as creator of the game, something forbidden by Atari management, has finally been confirmed by Atari itself.
They found the room. Abort mission.
I guess too many people have been asking about it. So the company says it will now begin to hide Easter eggs in its games intentionally and let Electronic Games Magazine know which games have such hidden bits without revealing where they are. Robinette had already left Atari in 1980 to co-found the Learning Company.
Yeah, I keep forgetting that Atari had this weird policy about putting your name on it.
Yeah, well, and the idea was that they didn't want their programmers and designers to be hired away.
Yeah.
They also wanted to sell the image that this was an Atari game as opposed to a game created by so-and-so for Atari.
Exactly, because good games come from Atari, but there are only noobs working here, so no need to hire them away from that.
And here we could talk about the famous towel designers line, which may or may not have been said. So, here the whole deal is that they finally have to come clean that this was there. But at the same time, now they're going to pretend that they're adding this into the games. We'll see in the coming months if we actually get any additional listings in Electronic Games about this.
Mm-hmm.
I personally wouldn't expect it, but it is possible that they do it, and it's just basically Atari having to admit, because too many people have found out about this. Even in a pre-internet age, people are talking about how to do this, and
they talk.
They talk.
Yeah.
They really talk. And I probably should have put this in a different place on the list, because we will be talking about how Electronic Games is a magazine now, and there's suddenly magazines dedicated to games, and this kind of stuff will no longer be controllable, if you will.
Okay. Easter eggs. I mean, Easter eggs are always something funny. It's always nice to find an Easter egg.
Yeah. And it's not the first Easter egg ever in a game, but it's the first one that really comes to prominence that anybody really takes note of, especially because it clashes so heavily with Atari's no credit policy.
I mean, credit where credit is due. I just think it's funny that this guy put himself in the game and not maybe his team or a couple more names.
Oh, no, there was no team. These games were all made by one person.
Oh, well, I mean, then I would have hung a huge oil painting somewhere in the game just for people to see.
It is a 2600 game. This was as close as it was getting to any kind of credit, okay? But no, these games are all made by one person at this point. They're all one-man shows.
Let's leave the garage and go to space, because Asteroids brings bank switching to the VCS.
Apparently, due to the poor initial reception of an advanced version of Asteroids for the VCS, Atari doubled the memory of the cart from 4 to 8K via bank switching, making Asteroids the first game to use bank switching on the console.
So bank switching being the developer sending you some new hardware you plugged in?
No, this is more akin to what Nintendo did in its cartridge systems. They're adding something into the cartridge. So when the VCS was originally conceived of, it could only handle 4K of memory in the cartridges. Mm-hmm. Now, the way you got around this was bank switching. So what you're really doing is you're using 4K, and then when you need to do something else, you basically convince the system that you're using the same 4K, but now you've switched to a different set of 4K of ROM, and you're now loading stuff off of there. And I'm oversimplifying this, I know. Mm-hmm. But what you're really doing is you're convincing the computer, the CPU, that you still only have 4K, but you're constantly switching between two different sets of 4K for the different bits of data. So it requires you to coordinate your game data and always know which of the two banks of 4K of ROM chips has the data that I need for this particular routine this cycle.
Well, this sounds demanding.
Oh, it's extremely demanding. I mean, this is one of these things, and there's going to be much bigger games later on, so you're doing all sorts of bank switching in order to make it possible. Now, the bank switching technique was originally developed for video chess. We've talked about that game in the past here on the show, but then they didn't use it because they managed to get the code down to 4K. And Atari balked at using it because it basically doubled the cost of the cartridge, because now you have twice as much many ROM chips in there. And this is also because even though Asteroid sells phenomenally, because of that additional cost, this is going to be one of the reasons why the Pac-Man port turns out the way it turns out, because they will refuse to use 8K in that Pac-Man port. They're going to leave it at 4K. And yes, it will show. It will show. Yes. No, it was not. Oh, well.
Oh, well.
So let's move away from consoles and get in some computer action.
Oh, yeah. Commodore licenses Bally games.
Bally. Not Bally.
Not Ballsy. Sorry. Okay, once more. Commodore licenses Bally games.
There you go. Bally has signed a deal that would give Commodore rights to release home ports of their arcade games for their home computers. Through this deal, Commodore intends to ensure game software for its VIC-20 computers, which, according to Irving Gould, chairman of Commodore, thanks to its $299 price tag, is comparable to many of the existing game consoles on the market.
So, with this deal, you can play your favorite arcade games at home.
Well, if your favorite games happen to come from Bally, yes. But
so what kind of games came from Bally? Because I haven't heard of Bally.
Well, Bally was traditionally a pinball maker, but they were also huge, and they still are today, huge in slot machines. They had also gotten into fitness studios. I mean, they did a bunch of stuff. But at this point, Bally is also the U.S. distributor of a bunch of Japanese titles, especially the Namco games, like you may have heard of Pac-Man.
Oh, yeah.
That's a Bally release. So later on it's going to be Bally Midway. They are already at this point. I can't remember when the merger happens. But yeah, so Bally is not really developing a lot of stuff on their own, but they are licensing a lot of stuff from Japan at this point.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what's going to end up happening, which is interesting, because Commodore, remember, Jack Tramiel was extremely paranoid about the Japanese coming in and doing in the microcomputer market what they did in the calculator and digital watch market. And so the VIC-20 actually gets released in Japan first. Gets a face. It looks different in Japan, but it gets released in Japan first, only by a couple of months. But it gets released in Japan first, and then in North America, and then in Europe. And they have relationships in Japan to also produce software for it.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those games, one of the companies they get to make those games is HAL Laboratories, the guys who would later on make Kirby and the Super Smash Brothers series and a bunch of other great titles for the NES and for Nintendo platforms. Mm-hmm. And among them are two titles that they released, Radar Rat Race and Star Battle. And these were modified versions of Rally X and Galaxian. Oh. I mean, this is all coming down the pipeline a little bit later. And they had the rights to make these. These were licensed titles from Namco in Japan. But they didn't have the rights to release those in North America because those games belonged to other companies. And they changed the graphics on Rally X into Radar Rat Race. So it was supposed to look, instead of like a race car, it was supposed to be a remote-controlled rat or something. They did a very, very quick and sloppy change of the graphics, and that was enough. And Bally had the U.S. distribution, the North American distribution rights for these games. So as far as I understood the story, that Bally sued or at least threatened to sue them. And they probably, this is what leads to this deal of Commodore licensing Bally titles. Now, Bally already had a few games of their own. Remember, Wizard of War was one of theirs. You played that a few months back. Yeah. They also had Seawolf and Gorf, and all of these would get ports onto the Commodore VIC-20, and a lot of them would also get ported to the Commodore 64 when that comes out in 1982. Yeah.
So, a good deal for Commodore.
It's a good deal for Commodore. Now, granted, it's a very typical Commodore approach of, it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So they just go ahead and do it, and then it's like, well, we already did it, so let's work out some terms. And another little interesting bit of trivia here, the Galaxian port, which is called Star Battle, that was actually programmed by Satoru Iwata of HAL Laboratories. And he would, of course, famously become the head of Nintendo years later. But this was one of his first big assignments, was to port this game to the VIC-20.
Okay, and taking all he's learned there, he made Nintendo one of the console companies whose games can hardly be hacked. Oh Lord, this was so butchered. But you know what I mean.
No, I don't. No. Nintendo games can be hacked. They can be hacked all over the place.
Oh, of course they can be hacked, but piracy, they can hardly be copied, the game.
Oh yeah, that's because that's why nobody has any NES or Super NES ROMs, or better said, that's why Nintendo didn't resell somebody's online dump of a ROM from one of their games.
With minimal time. You know what? Screw it. Let's move on.
There you go. Just move on.
Let's move on. Metamorphic Systems wants to make your Apple II a PC compatible.
Just like with Microsoft's Soft Card, which gave Apple II owners access to a Z80 processor to run CP/M before it, Metamorphic Microsystems has announced the launch of their Metacard, an add-on board to the Apple II that will sport a 5 MHz 8088 processor, the same one powering IBM's brand new PC. The ability to run CP/M 86 on your Apple using 64K of RAM won't be cheap, though, with the card costing $950.
Why?
Because you're an Apple devotee and you desperately want to keep your machine and still use the big boy computer. I mean, I should say it this way. Remember that at this point in time, computers are an extremely, extremely expensive investment. Mm-hmm. If you've already bought an Apple II and now suddenly you see, oh, wait a second, IBM released this big new computer. Do I drop $2,000 on a full IBM setup, or do I get the IBM compatibility and still keep my existing Apple hardware and software investment by just adding this extra card that gives me a second CPU to access?
Yeah, but did the CPU come with the card, or did you have to buy the CPU separately?
No. It came on the card. For $950, you're buying this card. You plug it in, and you can actually boot up using the Apple's video output and everything, but you could boot up a version of the IBM compatible. Now, it's not completely compatible, and I couldn't find too many details on it. This doesn't seem to have lasted very long on the market, unlike the soft card. So it probably fizzled out relatively quickly, but it would have given you those additional options.
Yeah, but could it also address the entire 64K of RAM and all the specifics that make an Apple II an Apple II?
No, it would have its own RAM on the card.
So basically, well, wait, you have a card with an own CPU and with RAM.
Yeah, and you're plugging that into the add-on slot, one of the add-on slots in the Apple II.
You basically bought a mini computer.
Yeah. You basically bought a computer, and what you're doing is you're interfacing with the video and probably also the audio output of the Apple II and the keyboard and whatever other peripherals are there in order to interact with the software. Also, you're going to be using the disk drives from the Apple II with this thing.
Huh, okay. Hey, how did cooling the processor work back in the day?
It wasn't really an issue with these processors yet.
They just didn't get hot.
Well, they didn't get as hot as the ones nowadays because you didn't have the transistors as close to one another.
Yeah, okay, got it. Because I tried to picture how it will look like putting this add-on board in an Apple II.
Well, and it's not that they don't get hot. Also remember, to put in one of these add-on boards, quite often you have to leave the hood of the Apple II open because these cards are sticking out too far.
Yeah.
Some of them. And also there's quite a bit of extra room in there. And also remember when we talked about the whole heat sink shielding stuff, Apple bypassed having to put in the extra shielding, which is one of the reasons why the other machines ran so hot, because they didn't have a built-in TV interface. That way they avoided the FCC regulations.
Oh, yeah, right.
So this box doesn't have the same shielding that, for example, the Atari computers do.
I'm sorry. So you didn't have a heat trap. Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a couple of different factors here, but we're going to see this kind of wannabe, have two systems in one idea pop up again and again. It's going to be really big in the 90s for Amiga users. There's going to be all these add-on boards so you can have PC compatibility using your Amiga, so you can finally play Doom on your Amiga. But all they end up being is just a miniaturized motherboard that you plug in and with lesser specs at a higher cost, and you're not really gaining anything from it.
Okay. Oh, Lord. All right. You know what? Let's leave them add-ons and go back to real systems. IBM launches the 125.
Not IBM.
No,
HP.
they didn't. HP.
HP launches the 125. I know, it's late.
Yeah.
So HP, Hewlett-Packard, does not want to be left behind in the business market, but unlike IBM, has decided to go with tried and true 8-bit tech. The HP 125 runs on 2 Z80 chips and is using CP/M as its operating system. The $4,950 price tag is a bit of a whopper.
How much?
$5,000. Yeah. That silence is justified.
Seriously, Lord, could you teleport with that thing?
You hope so. Yeah, no. The idea here really is that they're going for the idea of this big workstation.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be like this ultimate office computer type of thing. And they're doing the same thing that the East Germans were doing was, let's do 5 Z80s in here. That'll make it work, right? Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's not a viable way forward. But they're trying it. And, of course, HP is going to become a leading player in the PC-compatible arena once that opens up soon.
Yeah.
But right now they're still going it alone. They're trying to use industry standard stuff like CP/M. And, I mean, we keep talking about CP/M today because the idea of Microsoft's DOS hasn't really caught on as the system yet.
Yeah. Okay, but did actually anyone buy the thing?
I have no idea. I don't know what the sales numbers on it were and stuff. No way of knowing.
Oh Lord. Okay. I have nothing to add to that. So let's just move on. Compute Magazine profiles the state of Japanese micros.
Compute Magazine profiles a smattering of Japanese microcomputers this month, from Sharp's MZ80B to NEC's PC8000 over the Fujitsu Micro 8 and the amazingly named Bubcom 80. While many companies, known in the West for other products like Casio and Sanyo also have computer offerings. Interestingly, they also discuss the immense quantity and quality of the games available for these machines, despite the fact that they are mostly designed for workplace use. The author writes that the level to which video games are a part of the culture in Japan exceeds that in the US, and the high-resolution graphics on these systems makes perfect imitations of the major arcade machines possible.
I mean, 8K. What's there to add?
8K?
8K, yes.
No. 8,000. Not 8K of RAM. You're talking 8,000. Yeah.
Joke.
Well, most of these have an 8 in the title because they're almost all using the Z80 processor.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, all those today's Intel processors are not better. Still, those names.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's really no naming conventions yet for...
Really?
Not really. I mean, nobody's calling the computer, the Macintosh. That whole idea of Apple's of giving the computers names. I mean, remember, they just released the Apple III a while ago. It was a disaster. And what they're going to follow it up with the Lisa. Then there's going to be the Macintosh. The Lisa. Oh, we'll talk about the Lisa when we're
okay.
It was the Macintosh before the Macintosh. And I know I'm oversimplifying that, but the idea really is that to give a computer a quote-unquote name isn't a thing yet, but it will be there. And the interesting thing for me in this article was, number one, the huge number of companies creating their own computer systems. Remember, almost none of this stuff is compatible with one another. And second, the fact that even though they're not really selling a lot into the home market, there's just this massive quantity of games already. Yeah. And that is something that, I mean, the West is just picking up on that, but these guys are already deep in it, and it is going to give them a bit of a head start. Also, you have to remember, because a lot of these systems are at least attempting to display kanji, the resolution on the graphics have to be higher, which also gives them a huge leg up in graphics for games.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did they have a panic button?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of.
Okay.
I do not know that they had a panic button, but why do you ask?
No, just you know.
Oh, okay.
Be careful, the bus comes button.
Oh, yeah, no. Now, Leisure Suit Larry had one of those, but no, I don't think these guys did.
Moving on, British drugstore chain to become computer retailer.
We reported back in our August 1981 jump that newsstand chain W.H. Smith was entering the computer business by selling Sinclair's line of microcomputers. Now, UK drugstore chain Boots is joining the fray as well by test marketing the TI 99-4 in 6 of their shops over the holidays. They aren't completely new to the world of high-end electronics, though, as they were the first UK chain to carry pocket calculators a decade earlier.
Talking about diversification.
Yeah, definitely. They said a decade earlier. It's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, maybe 6 or 7 years early. But this is an interesting one. But for our British listeners and people who have followed the British home computer industry, Boots and W.H. Smith become synonymous with this kind of media consumption. They just become huge names in this area.
And what about the drugstore business?
I think Boots is still around as a drugstore. Don't quote me on that. And W.H. Smith, I don't think they're around at all anymore. But again, I'd have to look it up. But the idea here is that the computer business is going to basically live side by side. Similar to, in Germany, you have Müller, which is a chain that in addition to all of your perfume and bathroom supplies and so forth, they're also one of the biggest toy retailers in the country and one of the biggest media sellers, CDs, DVDs, records, things like that. And you can go in there and also pick up, a game console if you want. So it's not an unheard of setup.
I mean, it's like a slimmed down version of a Walmart superstore.
Basically, it's the kind of setup that works in a European city where real estate is at a premium and people are not necessarily going to drive all the way outside of town just to go shopping.
Yeah, not necessarily. Okay, moving on. Acorn gets approval for 50% grant for a UK secondary school.
Acorn hasn't just gotten the BBC on board to back their new microcomputer, the BBC Micro, as we talked about in our July 1981 jump. Now the UK government has agreed to provide secondary schools with a 50% grant to help finance the purchase of Acorn BBC microcomputers for classrooms.
Weren't the Acorn computers those things that didn't really work?
No, the Acorns worked. I mean, their first machines weren't super great.
Sinclair, sorry.
Yeah, no, Sinclair. And this was the main reason Sinclair didn't get that contract, because his machines just weren't reliable. But Acorn, they got the contract for the BBC Micro, as we talked about previously. And now the government is going to pick up 50% of the tab of the acquisition of these machines for secondary schools. And it's going to be one of the reasons why they're going to become almost ubiquitous in English schools throughout the 1980s. Yeah. And a lot of game developers that are even in the business still today are going to get their start by playing around on those computers that were in the classrooms.
Okay. Sticking to the United Kingdom, computer and video games launches in the United Kingdom.
With a cover date of November 1981, one of the most important and longest-running games mags in UK history launches. Computer and video games would run until October 2004.
Well, good for it. Is there a successor or a parent company they belong to?
I don't know who owned them towards the end, but they did try to survive as a website for a while after that, and I don't know how long that lasted, but that also is history. So, they lasted until 2004. By then, there were a lot of other magazines out there. The big problem for them was that they covered both console games and computer games. At a certain point, you just couldn't cover enough stuff in one magazine to do that. So the idea of the multi-format magazine had kind of had its time in the sun and was dead. So, but they're hugely important resource for the next couple of decades, and one that, very beloved magazine. This early version of it is kind of interesting because it's also a lot of type-in listings are still in there. This idea that, you're not going to be buying all your software, you're going to be writing it yourself. So there's a lot of that in the magazine still. Obviously, it's going to drop away to nothing relatively quickly, but at least here in this first issue, the type-in listings are a huge portion of the magazine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sticking to the Macs, Electronic Games launches in the United States.
Another dedicated gaming mag hits the streets. Without a cover month, but simply listed as the winter issue, Electronic Games would be one of the first of its kind in North America and was founded by Bill Kunkel, Arnie Katz, and Joyce Worley.
Is this thing still around?
No. This first run of the magazine runs until 1985. Now, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz, they had been doing columns in a magazine called Video, which was actually about the home video industry and video cameras, video cassettes, things like that. They'd have a column in there about video games. We've talked about them a couple times, like the review of Adventure. And so the first version of this magazine, and they're also the guys who wrote that New York Times article we talked about earlier. So it's going to run until 85, relaunched again in 92, and then go defunct in 97.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the weirdest things about it is they don't refer to gamers as gamers. They refer to them as home arcaders.
Oh, well, you have to distinguish yourself somehow.
Yeah. It's it also just shows that there's no fixed terminology yet. We're not talking about them as gamers. We're talking about them as arcaders or home arcaders. It's kind of very, very awkward, but it's interesting to see it's all over the magazine.
This is the most 1980 story that we've ever talked about.
This next one?
No, this one.
This one? Yeah, it is. It is in many ways. But actually, the next one is probably the most 80s story ever.
This is actually pretty cool, and I like that this is the last topic of today. Rubik's Cube is taking the toy world by storm.
Despite strong competition from Dungeons & Dragons and Atari, Rubik's Cube seems to be the big hit with retailers. Despite knockoffs selling for a fraction of the price, the original from Ideal is still moving like hotcakes according to the Toy Trade Talk.
I was never able to solve those damn things.
Yeah, me neither. I could never get it. But the Rubik's Cube is going to be one of those giant sellers. And I know it's not directly video game related, but it is one of these, it almost feels computer age or space age technology, It's far more complex in the kinds of problems it requires us to solve than a traditional game. And I really, really think that it's another one of these signs of the time, just like with D&D, like we discussed earlier, that people are simply looking for a different type of entertainment. And Rubik's Cube fits into that mold.
Intellectual stimulation.
And there you go, intellectual stimulation. And I guess that's going to be the word of the episode, correct?
Oh, this is so going to be the word of the episode.
Excellent. Okay, we are at the end of our journey through time. I hope everybody had a good time going back with us.
I hope there's still people listening to this.
It's a bit of a longish episode. I'm sorry. There was just too many interesting stories. I didn't want to leave. I left a lot of stuff out, but this, I couldn't leave any more out. So everybody remember, check us out on the social medias. Check us out on the Patreon. All the links are in the show notes below. You can send us questions, comments at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. And remember to subscribe and give us a like, write us a review. It would be really nice to finally get a review someplace. And also, all the episodes are up on YouTube, so you can also check that out. And that's it for us. Peter, would you like to say goodbye to the fine folks at home?
I would so like to say goodbye to the fine folks at home. Goodbye.
See ya.